Thank you everyone for coming today. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Antonio Franco from the Joint Research Center in Ispra, Italy. Today he's going to be talking with us about the new EU chemical strategy. So thank you very much, Antonio, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, first of all, to Paul and to Matt for the invitation here. And also thanks to John for setting this up. This actually became an invitation from Paul. It was about a month ago. Paul sent me, asked me if I could give a JRC view on chemical risk and global change. And I think it was the 13th of October that day. And actually the day after was the day when the Commission published this chemical strategy for sustainability. So I could not refuse the offer because actually there wasn't a better time that you could have approached me, Paul. I hope next time you will not be that lucky. But here we go. Today I'm going to share you a little bit of a historical perspective of EU chemical policy with a view at to the future and how this new chemical strategy is going to play, taking into account of the trends that we see in the wider context. First of all, the disclaimer, the boring thing: this presentation and its content do not constitute an official position of the European Commission or its services. Neither the European Commission or any other person on behalf of the Commission is responsible for the use which might be made of this presentation or its content. So basically what this says is that this is a sharing some of the developments that the Commission is undertaking, but certainly mixed up with my own personal perspective of all of this. I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which is the science and knowledge service of the Commission. And its overall mission is to support EU policies with independent evidence throughout the whole policy cycle. The Joint Research Center is located in 5 different places. It's headquartered in Brussels, but its main site is actually here in Italy, in the north of Italy, in the Lakes region. It's that white dot that you see underneath Switzerland there. It's a beautiful spot of the world, highly recommended if you have a chance in the future for your career. In total, we're about 3,000 people, most of them scientists. And that's the JRC. There's plenty of opportunity here for students in terms of traineeships, for early researchers as well. So keep an eye if you're interested in doing science, but in a policy context. EU chemical policy. The EU legislation has a history that go back as overall about 50 years of history, going back from the 60s when it first developed. And the current framework of chemical legislation is somewhere between 15 maybe years old or so. So it's been the legislation that is currently in place have been implemented over the last 15 years, let's say, and it was underpinned from a white paper that the Commission published in 2001, the so-called white paper that paved the way to REACH and overall has set a strategy for chemical policy in the last 20 years or so. And currently we have about 40 pieces of legislation that are considered the whole chemical policy framework. And over the last few years, roughly between 2016 and now, the Commission has undertaken a massive evaluation of chemical policy. And this was an initiative that was actually launched under the previous Commission, that is the Juncker Commission, to give the opportunity to the new Commission to take stock of where we stand with chemical policy, how much progress we have made, and what needs to be done. The current framework, as I said, is made of 40 pieces of legislation, and this is just a simplification of that whole framework. And this graphically is one way to map how all these pieces of legislation fit together. And myself, having a background in fate and exposure modeling, I like to see legislation as a barrier to control exposure. And that's the way I represent this in this graphical. As you see, there, humans and the environment, they can be exposed to chemicals from different settings, from the workplace, from these different products. And at the top there, you see some of the core elements of the EU legislation on chemicals, that are the REACH and the CLP, that governs the manufacturing and placing into the market and labeling of chemicals. You then have a group of legislation on the top right there that deals with chemical exposures and risks in occupational and industrial settings. You will then have a number of regulations at the level of products, and these can cover both risks to human health or the environment, or both. And these product level regulations, they vary in the way they interplay with some of the other regulations, and especially with REACH. You then have a set of environmental regulation. They are closer to the environment, dealing with water and air and other environmental media, and also legislation that deals with chemicals in food. And the scientific assessments that underpins this legislation, they are carried out by various authorities and agencies at EU level, which corresponds to the color coding that you see here. So, for example, ECHA takes care of the legislation that you see in light blue there. EFSA, the Food Safety Authority, is responsible for the scientific work underpinning the legislation that you see there in yellow, pesticides and food contaminants, for example. Those legislation that you see in red, they're actually managed centrally by the Commission or its scientific committees. You then also have EMA, the medicinal agency, with those two regulations in purple there. So I'm showing all these. This is to show how complex the legislative landscape is, and to explain some of the scope and the objectives of the regulations are actually different and specific. And also, in various extent, the risk management principle of these pieces of legislations is very specific. That means that they can be based on risk-based assessments, on hazard-based assessments. They can take into consideration risk and benefits in a risk-benefit fashion. And they can also mix various elements of these hazard-based, risk-based, risk benefits. And as I said, this is very specific to the individual pieces of legislation. And the point here is that understanding all this is really important, I think, and it's helpful for researchers to make sure that when they come out with recommendation, when they want to show how their findings can have an impact on policy, it would be really beneficial if researchers would be familiar with the basics of all of this. So that's my first message, maybe for today. Really, if your work is specifically focused on some type of chemicals or some regulatory areas, familiarize with basic principle of the underpinning legislation. That's really helpful. And this framework is not static. It evolves over time, and it follows the so-called policy-making cycle. Legislation is proposed in the top right there. You can see legislation is proposed, it's debated, it's then adopted, it is implemented, it is monitored and evaluated, and improvements are considered. And before any changes, we do those so-called the impact assessment of different policy options. And again, here, I think for scientists, it's really important to understand where the research questions that they're addressing, how they fit to the policy cycle if they want to make an impact. Much of the work that we do, we think that helps the implementation of legislation that is addressing questions such as what are the priority substances of concern, what are the risks associated with those substances, what are the main exposure sources. All this kind of research helps to implement the regulation. But in other cases, it may be about evaluation of legislation rather in a broad context. So addressing questions such as what is the effect of risk management on exposure? So for example, when you ban a chemical, do we see exposure going down? Or questions, even bigger questions, such as has legislation been effective in protecting human health and the environment? These are important questions that the Commission asked them itself, and they obviously need support from the science. I look into the future with policy developments and implementing potential changes, looking at how emerging trends of exposure and risk can also feed into the debate there. So I mentioned that in recent years we have these series of policy evaluations. I don't know if you ever heard about this, but I think it's very important actually. It's a piece of the policy cycle that is somehow not very well known, I think, outside the Commission. The Juncker Commission launched this better regulation initiative which aimed at evaluating the effectiveness, the efficiency, the coherence, the relevance, and the added value to the EU of legislation. And there you see a few examples of pieces of legislation that underwent this policy check. We had the REACH review. We had a massive evaluation of the whole chemical legislation, excluding REACH, because the REACH evaluation was already done. We then had the evaluation of the water legislation, of the plant protection products legislation. And most recently, we actually at the JRC led an evaluation of EU legislation on endocrine disruptors. And that was unique in its sense because its scope was not defined by legislation, but it was defined by an issue, which is the issue of endocrine disruptors and how this is dealt with across the board of applicable legislation. So I'm not trying to summarize the findings of all this massive piece of work, but there are some common elements in terms of effectiveness that I thought was useful to share here. Definitely, the latest generation of chemical legislation has brought a stronger knowledge base on chemicals, which is good. There has been significant progress in regulating substances of concern, which is good. There is some evidence of the benefits of legislations to human health and the environment, although we have to recognize that evidence is rather scattered and limited to certain exposure and risk settings and specific substances. It is very difficult to prove that legislation brings benefit to human health and the environment. And especially, there are still trends of concern, both for human health and the environment. Regarding human health, we still have increase in a number of non-communicable diseases, such as some cancers, diabetes, neurological diseases. These are on the rise. And for ecosystems, we know that wildlife populations are declining. Insects, birds, and biodiversity is declining. So, we haven't achieved the target really in the broader sense, but this may not only be about chemicals, obviously. And then came the new Commission. New year, 2020 or late 2019, when was it? This new Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, took place, and it was a historical moment really for the wider environmental policy. And as you probably know, it was the first time that a Commission put environment as a policy priority number one. Earlier commissions always focused first on economy or on the integration of the European Union. This Commission came in and said, we are going to have the Green Deal as the core priority here. We want to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. And that was the flagship of the European Green Deal, which is one of the 6 policy priorities of the Commission. But the Green Deal actually is more than that. The Green Deal encompasses a wide range of initiatives. So starting from the top left of this graphical there, certainly climate. The climate ambition is very high, with the target of climate neutrality by 2050. But it also addressed security, addressed energy. It addresses aspects of the circular economy. It's about building an infrastructure and renovating buildings and infrastructure. It's about smart mobility, about sustainable food systems, about biodiversity, And last but not least for us is about this zero pollution ambition, what they call it, for a toxic-free environment. And there is where this new chemical strategy has been positioned. But by no means is the only one that is relevant to chemicals. As you can imagine, these pillars are all interlinked with each other. For example, under the farm to fork strategy, the Commission set the ambition to halve the use and the risk of pesticides by 2030. Again, a very huge ambition. But the chemical strategy, what is it? For the chemical legislation, this is obviously core. Itself, this single strategy has a very ambitious set of actions. It's about encouraging safe and sustainable by design. And here the concept is really to help industries to move away from considering chemical safety as a regulatory compliance only, or maybe as a corporate responsibility, as corporate image kind of driver, to really bring safe and sustainable chemicals from the design phase. So really from research and development down the way to marketing and regulatory compliance. Companies should really implement chemical management systems that go across the whole innovation pipeline. It then aims at improving the knowledge on chemical properties and uses, but it aims at doing that without increasing the use of animal testing. And we know the big challenge there. We have a huge amount of chemicals that is still data poor, but still the standard framework relies heavily on animal testing. And the Commission has a directive from 2010 actually that aims at minimizing animal testing. So it's important that we, yes, improve the knowledge on chemical properties and toxicities and uses, but we don't want to use more animals, actually want to minimize those. It aims at addressing mixtures. For example, there is an ongoing proposal to introduce a mixture assessment factor under REACH. There's more about mixtures in the strategies. I'm just teasing out some of the key elements. Then it aims at phasing out the most harmful chemicals from consumer products. And this logic is actually already in there for some of the hazard categories, namely carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxicants, and PBTs. But it aims at enlarging the scope of this logic to a wider range of chemical classes, including endocrine disruptors and other types of toxicities. This is probably from a regulatory perspective the biggest move and the one that is having the biggest impact and the biggest debate right now. We then want to improve the interoperability of data and methods and models. As we know, the technical tools that have been developed underpinning this big legal framework have been developed in silos, and often data and models sits in policy domains that don't talk to each other. And there's definitely a need to improve all of that. And in fact, this higher level of ambition is accompanied by an intention to simplify the framework and consolidate. So this is not going to be about having new legislation, but it's about consolidating and strengthening what we have already in place. And all of this, I teased out 3 themes that I wanted to share with you today. And these are very much my personal reflections on this strategy. The first one is the need to move towards alternatives to animal testing. And why this is important. As we want to identify the higher number of hazard categories to possibly regulate and phase out possibly, not only including substances that cause cancer, gene mutations, and reproductive disorders, but also endocrine disruptors, persistent and bioaccumulative chemicals, chemicals that affect immune and neurological and respiratory system, and chemicals that are toxic to specific organs. All these chemical categories, to identify that, we need more information. And as that information cannot come from animal testing, it needs to come from alternative methods. And the current situation is that we have a few methods, alternative methods, non-animal methods that have been validated at the OECD level in a standard way and have been standardized. But we have many more, but these methods are not sufficient to achieve the objectives that are laid out in the strategy. So we really need to be more brave and make use of both standard and non-standard methods in some ways, to screen, perhaps do some screening of the vast amount of data poor chemicals. And you're probably seen before the other iceberg, the ones that shows the chemical universe, where we have on the floating above the surface the chemicals for which we know enough, and underneath the surface the chemicals for which we don't know enough. And here is the other iceberg. Really, we need to use the full iceberg of alternative methods that is coming from the research field to tackle the big iceberg of chemicals for which we don't know enough. And this requires commitment from all stakeholders, and including European agencies. So we need to embrace the modern safety assessment toolbox. And this slide is an overview of what is meant by this modern safety assessment toolbox. And this is obviously a huge challenge, but there's been massive progress in this field. And the key word there is integrating the various methods and gaining the confidence to be able to use them together, and increasingly replacing animal testing. I'm not an expert in many of these, I would say of these elements, but I'm fortunate enough to be surrounded by colleagues that are competent in these areas that are going to be the hazard assessment toolkit of the future. Every couple of years we have a summer school here at the JRC. So for those who are interested in this topic, highly recommended. This summer school goes beyond regulatory toxicologies, but look at alternative methods used across science. It's a very good course, I have to say. I took it myself the first year I was here, and very informative. Registrations are open for this summer school that is coming up next spring. The second element I wanted to share with you is about the way exposure assessment is going to change in the future. And here we can see big shifts in the pattern of production and consumption of chemicals. A few facts there. The chemical industry is growing fast globally. It's expected to double the size between 2017 and 2030. This is data from the chemical industry, actually. So that is huge. And growth is happening across many sectors, as we know, in the chemical industries, the industries of industries, that enables a number of other sectorial industries to flourish. But especially there will be a high demand for those chemicals and technologies that are needed to drive the change toward climate neutrality. So things like chemical used in photovoltaics, wind farms, batteries, electrical mobility, fuel cells. These are going to be skyrocketing demands of the chemicals underpinning that. And the third aspect here is the need for circularity. And we need to move towards circularity for two main reasons. The first one is about strategic independence. And this is about making sure that the European Union is not dependent on external countries for strategic raw materials. So there's a big economic need towards circularity. And then there's the other big need, which is about environment, which is about reducing waste, which is about making sure that those hazardous chemicals that we still need to use, they're managed in closed loops, in controlled loops, so that we can actually monitor and limit the emissions of hazardous chemicals. And I think these three aspects are going to have a huge impact on exposure, on chemical exposures. Now, zooming into some of these, this is a graphic that represents where chemical industry stays at the moment, and the projected growth towards 2020. As I said, the size of chemical industry globally is expected to double the size, and most of the growth is going to happen in China. not in the rest of the world, in China. And what I found amazing in this graphical is that not only the share of chemical industries is decreasing as far as the European Union is concerned. So for the European Union, chemical industry is going to grow, but the share of chemical industry globally is going to decrease significantly. And this is true for most of the regions of the world, actually, including the rest of Asia. So the share of chemical industry is going to decrease for the rest of Asia. It's only China that seems to be growing here. I find that quite rather impressive. And this is about the circularity, or the current state of art in the European Union about circularity. This graphical is from Eurostat and shows the material flows in EU27. This doesn't look very circular. As you can easily see, the arrows that lead to emissions and to material accumulations are larger than the recirculating arrow that is the recycled materials. Now this needs to change. This is going to change. And obviously, to me, that will have significant impact in the way we carry out exposure assessment for a number of substances and products. That is, exposure assessment will address not only the full life cycle of the first product, the first life cycle, but all the subsequent life cycles. And I don't think this is yet captured very well in technical guidance and tools that we have. So we need to address that. We need to improve. There's a few practical, concrete intentions that are laid out in the strategy that deals with this shift. The Commission knows that we need to be better at tracking chemicals, hazardous chemicals in materials, products, and the environment. And one action towards that target is the implementation of the so-called SHIP database carried out by ECHA. This database is capturing the presence of substances of very high concern identified under REACH in products. So if you are producing a product that contains a substance of very high concern, you need to notify that to ECHA. So in the end, we will be able to track hazardous chemicals in material streams. And this is hopefully bring benefits to the waste industry and the recycling industry. But it's just an example. We then need to be better at estimating emissions from products through life cycles, as I said, including waste. And we need to develop methodologies to link materials and product life cycles with the exposure assessment. And there, that's represented a bit in the graphic on the right, I think. I myself been taught very much about how to do exposure assessment, exposure modeling. We learned and we have developed quite sophisticated exposure models at various scales and levels of resolutions. But what we haven't been as smart as a society, let's say, is to map the mass balance of chemicals in materials and products. This is something that the industry haven't been particularly keen on sharing, really. So there's a policy issue there in the first place, but certainly the scientific community has a role to play in really integrating the full picture of chemical mass balance, both in the technosphere and in the environment. And last but not least, the global dimension of all these assessments. Ideally, the increased ambition that the European Commission is showing and the increased commitment in improving how we follow and we track chemicals is shared at the global level, so that we can be better at assessing trade flows of substances of concern across countries as well, as we know that trade is global. The third important element, I think, of the strategy, perhaps the flagship of the strategy, is that we are moving towards a higher level of protection. And the driver for that, I think, was politically related to the concerns that citizens have about chemicals and the environment. This is how this new, very ambitious strategy could be supported. People want this. People are concerned about chemicals in the environment. People are concerned about chemicals in their everyday products. But actually, the knowledge we have on the overall impact of chemicals is limited. We still struggle to grasp long-term effects and the large-scale effects. We still struggle to address mixtures, to understand how multiple stressors play, and really to understand the trade-offs, because we can raise the bar as much as we want. Well, we can raise the bar of chemical safety, but that comes with trade-offs between safety and sustainability, between safety, sustainability, and socioeconomic implications. And chemical industry has raised a debate there in saying that, you know, if we want durable materials, we need chemicals, but then we don't want those chemicals at the same time. So trade-offs and understanding those trade-offs must be central in future efforts, research efforts. So there's a clear recognition that we need a stronger evidence base on chemical impacts. So the emphasis there is from being able to identify chemical risks, which we think, well, Commission thinks, I think, that we've become smarter at, but we haven't become as smart to understand the real impacts. And to do that, there's a number of actions that aim at targeting this ambition, this objective. Digital innovations, tool methods and models, data and capacity. So there are going to be huge investments in that space. The Commission is going to have wider monitoring initiatives, both for humans and the environment at European scale. Is going to launch an early warning action system on chemicals risk. And importantly, is going to develop a framework of indicators to monitor the drivers and impact of chemical pollution. And this really relates something that was missing in the last series of policy evaluations. We just don't have those indicators. We don't know how well we are progressing. We at the JRC are trying to make a contribution to all of this in our limited capacities. One area that we are taking care of is this information platform of chemical monitoring, which is a relatively new initiative aimed at bringing a central platform of chemical monitoring data. And this is composed of 4 modules. It covers environment, humans, food, and indoor air. And we are working together with various agencies and policy DGs to make sure that this data set is improving. It's growing in size. We have so far about 450 million data records there, and it's increasing fast. And one of the focus area there has been in human biomonitoring, which is relatively new to chemical legislation. So hopefully this platform is contributing to making human biomonitoring data and other monitoring data available, not only to policymakers, but also to the wider research community. And that's the end of my talk. I have shared here with you some of the useful links, I think, that cover some of the things that I discussed. And here you have also a link to the EU Science Hub, which is the science portal of the JRC. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Antonio. That was a really great talk. It was really, really interesting to get that perspective on legislation moving forward. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Ivanka.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for the really interesting presentation. One of the things I got from the Chemical Strategy for Sustainability is that the Commission wants to incorporate more data, more information from the scientific communities as well. So I kind of got that they actively want to, I don't know, search scientific literature, but I was wondering, what can we as scientists do? Because as you also mentioned in your presentations, there are so many unknowns still. So what can we as scientists do, let's say, if we work on a relevant topic and if we find something relevant for the chemical strategy, for that to be picked up by the Commission?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. So one actions that I think you referred to is to develop some sort of tool, and I don't know how this is going to look like, but it's going to facilitate. It's based on I don't know if you call artificial intelligence or whatever algorithms, but it's going to assist the people in the directorates to screen that scientific literature and to help them filtering the scientific literature towards the kind of knowledge that might be useful. At the moment, we are left with the standard tools that we all are aware of, let's say the Google Scholar and all the other search engines that, for a desk officer in Brussels, you can't expect them spending, months doing this kind of job. And so there's an activity there to develop some sort of algorithm to help. From the point of view of scientists, I think understanding the basics of the legislation, as I mentioned towards the beginning of my talk, really helps you to focus your recommendations. And if you use the right keywords, the right narrative for let's say for policymakers to really tune with what you're saying, so you're not lost in your world of science and providing recommendations that are sort of targeting the scientific community. If you show that you understand how the science feeds into the policy cycle and which sort of provisions, which mechanisms, which assessment processes should take into considerations of your outcomes, I think that helps massively. And the other thing I'm thinking about is the elements of public interaction that this policy cycle offers. So there are moments that there's a portal in the Commission, this better regulation portal, that enables you to see what's happening in terms of policy developments. And it's actually open to every citizen to provide inputs to any regulatory change that is going to happen. And the scientists have a special pathway to provide inputs in that way.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I would like to ask a question. So thank you for a very nice talk, very interesting. I'm Anna Sobek from Stockholm University. When I read this chemical strategy, I found it great. There are so many improvements to what we had before, and it made me really happy. So I would like to hear your opinion on how will we see the same when it is implemented? How much will it be diluted? As in my view, to implement this would be a radical change to how REACH has been implemented so far. Indeed,
this strategy didn't come without strong reactions from inside the commissions. Many from the people I'm working with, we were happy too. We have seen for years this compromise and always, almost a bigger attention to economy and environment as a nice to have policy target. This strategy has been debated for a year in Brussels, and before it was published, actually, we expected a lot of compromise, and in fact, it came out as it was announced. It was as strong. It came out of the negotiations as strong as it came in. That meant that the policy will was strong, and obviously there are different views even within the commissions. And often we have that process of negotiation and compromising. But when there's a strong policy priority, this was something really new for maybe that happens. It made through. So what's the next step? The implementation step. Will it stay as strong as it is? That's not for me to say. But the policy will is there. Mm. And I mean, industry's role in
in the implementation step. I mean, one thing is the use of non-standardized data, for instance, which I understand is not what industry asks for. And there they have a lot of saying in different working groups. I mean, yeah.
What's the question? Sorry.
About the use of non-standardized data to reduce animal testing. There are so many more, as you showed, alternative methods. And this would also be a radical change to how it has been used before, and nothing that I think that industry would enjoy.
Well, there's interesting developments happening there, I think. I think industry, as generalizing a little bit there, is siding with the embracement of alternative methods. But they're obviously concerned that these screening approaches will trigger action before formal identifications under those categories of hazard. And this is a game that is going to be shown in the next few years, I think. And I think the agency needs to show more flexibility in the way they implement those alternative methods. We are going to need more, I think that we're going to need more screening approaches and less rules, less hard triggers and more screening. But indeed, this is I don't think the agencies have experience in doing that yet. But I wouldn't say that industry is not siding with the non-animals or alternative communities. I almost see as the opposite. You may be aware of what happened recently with the cosmetics and the REACH regulation. I have seen reactions from some big industries siding, criticizing the request for new animal tests because it was done under REACH and not under cosmetics, but it was done for a substance that was only used in cosmetics. So at least some industry is willing to embrace the whole paradigm shift. And hopefully they're going to be, the ones that are lead the way.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, I might ask a question if that's all right. Sorry, folks, I'm just in the lab here. So, yeah, so just kind of between that dynamic of reducing animal testing, but also increased screening, a lot of the kind of assays that are being, I guess, developed for that are using embryo larval tests, which aren't technically considered animals until they're at a feeding stage, right? So could you foresee that possibly being changed and those actually being considered animals in the future? And then would that sort of, I guess, downplay the development of some of these embryo larval based screening assays? Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm afraid I cannot answer that question. I don't have the expertise. So I know that there's a strict definition of what an animal is and is not under the 2010 directive. But I'm not aware of a debate of changing that as yet. But I wouldn't say any more because I'm not an expert in this field. Some of my colleagues would be. I encourage you to get in touch with the EUL ECVAM, our laboratory for alternative methods, and my colleagues if you want to know more.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of a philosophical kind of debate, I guess, because I mean, I've worked with embryo larval fish and I mean, they seem pretty alive to me, but yeah, I can kind of see how it would go the other way, but thank you.
Yeah.
I can comment on this issue if that's okay. Yeah. So regarding the use of fish embryo as an alternative to fish, we have a new project at NIVA applying or developing and applying a model for this very purpose. And for me as a biologist originally, to distinguish between fish embryo and fish doesn't really make sense, I must admit, but I understand that this is still a very important issue for the animal alternatives community, that the fish embryo is a less developed stage and so on. But I've gained some insight into the whole animal alternatives development through this work, and what the model we develop in this project is meant to apply more generally. So the fish embryo, live fish, can be seen as one case study, and I understand that this is a very, very long process. My colleagues who have been working to get this fish embryo test accepted have worked on it for decades. So to get even more different animal alternatives methods accepted would be, I'm sure those are very long processes as well. But my experience now from this new project, this is funded by the chemical industry, by CEFIC. So we have a big monitoring board, 20 people or so from the chemical industry, and at least they seem quite interested and interested in contributing, giving feedback to our model and so on. So there is there is some positive development.
Yeah, I mean, I have worked in industry before, and a trend that I could see is that something that we don't think very often as safety scientists is that the corporate image of companies sometimes play to our benefit, in that companies in certain sectors don't want to use animals testing for their products, and that's a marketing driver nowadays. So cosmetic sector is definitely moving in that direction, and hopefully it's going to be followed by more. So it's consumer driven, not only safety.
Yes, some companies are not even allowed to be project partners in research projects if there are animal test data used. So I can post the link to this project in case anyone is interested. This is something we haven't really discussed much in this project, animal alternatives, but there seems to be quite an interest in this topic anyway.
No, thank you for doing that. Marcus, you had a question?
Yes, thanks, John. Hi, this is Marcus speaking. Thanks for the nice talk, Antonio. I have maybe a question that adds up a bit on what Janke asked in the beginning. I'm curious about your opinion. What do you think, or how do you see academia or maybe state research institutes involved in future chemical risk assessment? Do you think there will be a shift kind of that the big chemical companies are more responsible in future, so that they need to provide maybe, I don't know, more data or more evidence that the compound is safe before it comes on the market? And also with regards to the aspect that you said in your presentation, like the development of compounds, it's so fast, like there are rapidly new compounds out there, and for now I see personally a bit like especially academia a bit behind in this research progress, because they're still testing old kind of compounds and want to know the basic principles behind it, but how relevant is this still in the risk assessment aspect?
Can you reformulate a bit the question to make sure that I understand?
Yeah.
That I don't go.
Maybe
If you can focus a little bit. I think that I got the first part and then I got a bit lost.
Yeah, it was a bit long. I agree.
Sorry.
Maybe just to keep it short, like what do you think? How will academia and state research institutes be involved in chemical risk assessment in the future? Like for us as being ESRs, I mean, where will be our future?
That's a part of the question that I understood. In fact, yes. This is the Commission is trying something new in the next generation of research, and I know that there's been a big effort in shaping up what has been called so far as PARC, the Partnership for Risk Assessment, which is going to be a huge research program with a high level of coordination between the policy stakeholders in the Commission and the national authorities and academia. And what happened in the past is that EU-funded research would, yes, follow specific calls that were made by the Commission, obviously, but there wasn't a strong focus on streamlining some of that, much of that research into policy impact. And honestly, the Commission really struggled to make good use of that research. And that, compared to the regulatory framework that the new generation of chemical legislation place the burden to industry to prove safety and to generate data. And indeed, I would say chemical management over the last 10 years have been driven by knowledge generated by industry. And then the sea of knowledge from the academic field was used in a cherry-picking way, let's say, but it wasn't very streamlined yet. So the intention is that of going towards a model with a stronger interaction between policymakers and scientists. So stay tuned, and if you're a researcher and looking for funding from the EU, there's certainly new models to explore looking ahead.
All right, thanks for the answer. Interesting, yeah.
Antonio, I have a question. I found it really interesting, the data that you presented about the percentage of people in the EU that were concerned about chemicals in the environment, where it was pretty much every person. As somebody coming from the US, I don't think you surveyed people that would have exactly the same numbers. And I guess, what do you think would need to happen what do you think needs to happen in some of these other countries or places where there's not quite as much of this push for more comprehensive, better chemical legislation in order to move the needle on actually, getting better legislation in place?
I guess you need a social scientist to answer that one, John. And yeah, these numbers came up with it. So these numbers, just to make it clear, they come from Eurostat. That I'm not an expert on that, but the sample of population that they survey is a random sample. So those numbers don't come from the open consultation activities, where typically those people who have a strong opinion tend to participate. Yeah, those are numbers are supposed at least to represent the whole population. Mm. Well, that's a trend that has happened in Europe. This of people demanding more from environmental policy, and we could see that as in the recent European elections. With a significant wave of the green parties, or even the parties that were not green, come up with this chemical strategy that is fairly green. So these are dynamics that are happening, but at the same time, what does concern me is that doesn't come from scientific evidence. How to put it? It's not that the scientific evidence over the last few years have become so much stronger to drive those increasing concern, I would say. So where do we stop? We might overshoot if we continue to raise the bar. I don't know, but that's something that we need to take care of as well. What needs to happen in the other countries to change the world? I'm afraid that's a hard one.
That's fair. No, thank you. That was a very interesting perspective to give. So thank you for that.
Just a very short response to that for John. Also, there is a CTEC Science Cafe on the 10th of December, if I'm correct, where they will have a session on science communication also within COVID, because I think that's very interesting to compare also what you learn out of these very unusual situations in science communication. I know from Germany they have like a radar that also asks these questions, like what is your confidence in science, or how much do you trust science, for example? And that also changed quite within in the COVID time or during the COVID time. So it's very interesting, these topics. And I hope that's what they will discuss in this CTEC Science Cafe. So maybe that's good for everyone that's interested to know that that's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have a link to that?
I can share that in Slack later.
Okay, cool.
Or
Yeah.
I will try to find it now. Yeah.
Okay.
In the chat. Yeah.
If you're interested in these topics, I do encourage you to take a look at those, the first link in this slide, this Have Your Say portal. That's a public portal to input into policy initiatives. So share it with friends and colleagues.
All right, so we have about 3 minutes left. So if there are maybe 1 or 2 more questions, I think we have time for that. Yes, Yannicka, and then Alex.
Yeah, just very quick comment. You had some very nice graphics and overviews, and I'm thinking especially of the one that showed the different legislations and how they act as barriers to emission and so on. Could you share that or send a link to wherever it's available?
I'm really happy that you say that, because that's probably the only graphic that I actually did myself.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Somewhere else. It hasn't been published yet, really. So it's going to be part maybe of a publication soon, but not that soon, actually.
Okay.
But I'm happy to share if my boss allows to share all of this.
If possible, that would be great.
Alize, I believe you had a question.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm a PhD student. I wanted to know, what do you think is very important for the next step to reach all those goals? Do we need more research, or do we need better communication between scientists and the Commission? Do we need better algorithm? What do you think is the thing that we don't have right now that we need to reach all the goals from the Green Deal?
Well, I would limit my response to the science part of that. Yeah, what needs to be happen to achieve the goals in terms of the scientific evidence that we need to develop. And I think indeed this new experimental format of the next generation of research hopefully is going to bring the benefits that we hope in terms of translating new knowledge into science. And also in terms of co-formulating the research questions. I think that has been underestimated in the past, really. The scientific questions and the policy questions, they often don't match. And that is obviously a problem. So you need co-formulation of questions to make sure that we address the questions that are relevant to policy. You can see more focus on getting that right in the coming years, and any efforts from the scientific community to help towards that direction is also much appreciated. So that's why at the beginning I shared that basic awareness of legislation doesn't mean that you need to read those boring legislation, but having a basic understanding of the principles and the scope, really useful. Also for your research proposals, by the way. Because if you can develop a narrative that is compelling to people in Brussels, that's very helpful.
Thank you.
So that brings us to 4 o'clock. So unless there are any other short or pressing questions right now, I think we should thank, again, Antonio very much for this really great presentation, really great discussion that we had. So, yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to say?
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's been a pleasure from my side to engage in this nice discussion. Nice to meet you and see you, and good luck with your future.
Thank you very much.